the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, one of the great heroes of our country at all levels, frankly. I mean, he didn't just work on civil rights. So Lamar, let me just make sure that Lamar is still here. Yeah, Lamar is still on the board.
Still here, Tom.
Thank you, Lamar. So who had Dr. Martin Luther King killed, and why was he murdered in 1968? Let's get cut right to the chase here.
The very sad fact is that you really just in the same way that, Nixon's 68 campaign was all about money and power, illicit money, I should add, with all the bribes he was getting and the support from foreign dictators and the treason Nixon was committing. Kind of in a similar way, Martin Luther King was basically killed for money. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And that's why he wasn't killed. And it's just ironic, because he had the biggest target on his back of all the civil rights leaders and had for many years. But he was killed in 68 when his influence was actually starting to wane a bit, because you had the rise of other civil rights groups, especially the Black Panthers, the more radical groups. And so, but he was killed for money. And the conspiracy.
How so?
Actually originated here in Atlanta. And by the way, people should know this isn't conspiracy theory necessarily. Congress, when they did an investigation of King's murder in the late 70s, they concluded that James Earl Ray had been motivated by money. And they weren't able to exactly pin down whose money, and that's where my research...
So when you say by money, what you're saying is that James Earl Ray was essentially a paid assassin, right?
Oh, of course. James Earl Ray had not only never killed anyone, he wasn't a hitman, he never even shot anybody or shot at anybody. He was solely motivated by money, and that's the conclusion of the United States Congress. The money, well, where did that money come from? So basically, the bottom line is...
well, hang on just a second, Lamar. If I may. You said James Earl Ray never shot anybody. He did shoot Martin Luther King, didn't he?
Well, I mean, great that you caught that point. He never shot anyone before the King assassination. And I should say there's a lot of evidence that he fired the actual shot, but it cannot be proved to a certainty. But as you'll hear momentarily, that doesn't mean even if James Earl Ray did not fire the actual shot, he was still involved, but he probably did, but we just can't prove that to an certainty. So, but yeah, but prior to the King murder, I mean, he was a petty thief and crook, that's what he was. So, but here are the people who were making the big money on this. There were 4 Atlanta white supremacists, okay, 3 from Atlanta, 1 from a little town in South Georgia called Quitman, and these 4 men, who include the most well-known of which is a guy by the name of Joseph Miltier, the guy from South Georgia. But he was working with these 3 Atlantans and had been for at least 4 to 5 years. Every payday at one of Atlanta's largest factories, the Chevrolet plant, later the General Motors plant, in the Lakewood part of Atlanta, south of Atlanta. And it had up to 7,000 people working there. These were highly paid union jobs. These people, even if you were a high school graduate, you were making tons of money. You could buy a new Corvette Stingray. You can't do that as a high school graduate or even drop out today, that's for sure. But this was a different time. These were union jobs. And so, but this was the South, and you had many racist politicians and had those racist politicians for decades. So, some of those people who worked at that plant, and I worked at that plant when I was in college, were racist. Some were white supremacists. Those were very, the white supremacists and Klan supporters, they were a very small percentage. But you had a lot of other people who were racist because the neighborhood around this plant in south of Atlanta, which was, I would have to just call it a white middle-class paradise. I mean, it was just heaven on earth for people who would, say, come from Alabama or South Georgia or the hills of Tennessee. That whole neighborhood, you had this high-paying factory, you had these beautiful little houses, you had these great shopping districts, you had amusement parks, whites only, and if you were white, this was paradise. And what happened to that paradise starting in 1964-65, thanks to civil rights laws, was that Atlanta's cabal of real estate agencies basically started blockbusting Atlanta and they started with the neighborhood around that plant. So by blockbusting, I mean they scare white residents into selling their houses cheaply, and then they're sold to new black residents, and the most blatant scare tactics you could ever imagine. And so basically they turned that neighborhood into ground zero in this blockbusting war. The anger did not...
Why, Lamar, if I may interrupt, why were these real estate people doing blockbusting? What was in it for them?
Millions and millions of dollars. To found the family fortune, say, of, for instance, Johnny Isaacson, one of Georgia's senators today. So millions of dollars were made, because if you can scare someone to selling that house cheap, and then you can sell that house to a black family who before was never allowed to buy in this nice white neighborhood, you can sell it to them at a premium. And then once you move one black family in, you spread all these lies and rumors about that black family. And it was just, they literally carved Atlanta up like a steer, and neighborhood by neighborhood, millions of dollars were made. But the anger of the white residents, who now couldn't walk to work in the Lakewood neighborhood, they weren't a 5-minute drive. Now they take what little money they can get for their house. They have to buy a house way out in the suburbs, fight that traffic. Their anger does not go to Georgia Governor Lester Maddox, an ardent racist and supporter of Blockbuster. Their anger does not go to the real estate magnates. Their anger is channeled by the racist politicians to minorities, to Martin Luther King, who's the face of civil rights. And so these people were
Lamar, when you say that they couldn't walk to work, do you mean because they didn't want to encounter black people who might have moved into their community?
Well, no, what I mean is they were scared into selling their houses. So instead of being close enough to walk to work...
Oh, I see. So they had to move someplace else. I see.
And that someplace else is to the far suburbs, you know. And so... And so they literally destroyed what, in these people's minds, was a white paradise. And the anger felt was toward Martin Luther King, because remember, Martin Luther King, based in Atlanta, he wasn't just a national story in Atlanta. He was on the local news and in the local newspapers, you know, several times a week. So it was easy for these four white supremacists to point the finger at King and say, look, give us $5 this week, $4 next week, whatever, and we're going to use this money to kill Martin Luther King.
So is at the factory gate they were raising this money?
Yeah, they would be very overt.
As the guys were leaving work.
Exactly right. And when you've got thousands of people leaving work, there are all sorts of people outside. And of course, it always struck me odd that the General Motors officials never rousted these guys out, but a couple of these guys were professional men. One was a noted Atlanta attorney, the other was a dentist, in the neighborhood. And frankly, they didn't peddle let's kill King to everybody. To more moderate racists, and there are such things, sad to say, they would be peddling, well, we're going to fight against civil rights. We're going to take your neighborhood back. And unfortunately, General Motors, they supported groups like the John Birch Society, and so these four men would basically sell you what you were ready for. But the most ardent racists were ready to kill Martin Luther King, and they would be collecting this money. Now, what they were doing with that money, just like Nixon took a lot of his illicit money and put it into shady real estate deals, so did these people. They were buying undeveloped mountain land about 2.5 hours from Atlanta. You could see the writing on the wall, more people moving to Georgia. That was going to be worth some money. But let's say you're a racist and you've been giving $5 a week for 4 years, and nobody's even taken a shot at Martin Luther King. You're starting to get angry at these people. Hey, I'm not going to give you $5 this week. You keep saying you're going to have King killed, and I see more blockbusting and black people at my kids' school now. My kids are having to go to school. This is also when schools were desegregated in Atlanta, and so these people had to have somebody, if not kill King, at least take a shot at him. And so they literally put out a contract through the prisons looking for a recently emerged convict who would be willing to kill or take a shot at King. And it was a two-part contract. They were willing to give a certain amount of money, $25,000 to somebody to be the spotter, and then that spotter would alert the actual shooter who would make more money, between $50,000 and $100,000, to take the actual shot. But that way the shooter could remain in hiding literally until the second before he took the shot, because you have the spotter handling it. So James Earl Ray was a low-level escaped convict and drug runner for the Carlos Marcello organization, America's most ruthless godfather, that was based in New Orleans but controlled most of Texas, southern Mississippi. Marcello didn't feud with the surrounding mob bosses. He made deals with them, like the mafia up in Memphis, Tennessee, for instance, and Atlanta. And so James Earl Ray found out about this contract, whether he intended to be just the spotter or he wanted to take the shot. He sure never took any known target practice. He became part of this contract. And the reason the white supremacists, they first tried to recruit someone locally, were unable to, so then they turned to the professional, Carlos Marcello, to just broker that contract, take a fee.
So Marcello brought in James Earl Ray.